Today I'm going to talk about the ethics of artificial intelligence and specifically the ethics of autonomous cars. So I work at the MIT Media Lab, which is a really fun place to work as a scientist. It's like a playground. And I run a group of about 20 scientists, students and postdocs called the Scalable Cooperation Group. And my group's overall goal is to reimagine human cooperation in the age of social media and artificial intelligence. Because as you know, both these technologies can be weaponized, but they can also be used for good. So I'm really interested in how we regulate these systems. And to think about how to regulate a machine, we have to think first about how we regulate a human being. So Larry Lessig, who's a constitutional scholar at Harvard, defined these 4 forces of regulation. The way we regulate a human is through these 4 forces: laws, markets, architecture of the environment and the systems that we use, but also norms. Social norms regulate our behavior in important ways. Now, when you replace Larry here in the middle with a robot or an AI or a machine, then these forces also play or should play a role in this regulation. And as a case study, we can think of autonomous cars as an example of this kind of system, right? So, and the backdrop to this is the Isaac Asimov laws of robotics that many of you are familiar with. I just wanted to put them out there as a reminder of how we think about these kinds of problems. That machines should never harm a human being, they should never allow a human being to come to harm, and they also have to obey the orders of humans, and they should protect their own existence in this order. And Asimov even introduced a zeroth law, which is to make sure that machines do not harm humanity as a whole. So let's go back to autonomous cars now and think about the potential benefits of this technology. So more than 1 million people die every year due to traffic accidents, and autonomous vehicles promise to eliminate 90% of those accidents. That's a huge number and really huge, significant saving in life that make it imperative to develop this type of technology and adopt it quickly. But the problem is people are concerned about the behavior of these machines, which are literally driving massive pieces of metal in the urban environment. And this very kind of classic trolley problem emerges that people are use to exemplify this ethical trade-offs that a machine has to take. So in this scenario, a vehicle is about to crash into a bunch of pedestrians because maybe it's a group of children that is crossing the street all of a sudden, and the car can swerve and harm a bystander in order to save these pedestrians. Should the car do this or should it not? Who should decide? And so on. And more importantly, what if the car would swerve and harm its own occupier, right? The passenger in the car in order to save the greater number of people. Who does the car have a duty to protect? And who gets to decide these sorts of answers? Now, the transportation regulators have been thinking about these problems. They acknowledge that they are ethical, normative problems, and they acknowledge also that there is no consensus and no way to really measure metrics to evaluate against the behavior of these sorts of systems. And these things have basically been fundamentally unsolvable, but we have seen similar things before. For instance, this Bullbar or moose bar in Canada is a big shiny object in front of the car that has an impact on the safety of the occupant, increases their safety, but it also decreases the safety of people in other vehicles as well as pedestrians. So we make these sorts of decisions already about whether or not to allow these kinds of things. So for instance, in the UK, these things are banned. In the US, they are not. Now, the problem here is that in the autonomous vehicle, we don't have a shiny metal object. There is thinking that is causing the distribution of harm is inside the car. It's inside a black box, which is the algorithm that is driving the car. And these things don't have to be so black and white. It's not about killing one group of people versus another. It's a statistical thing. So for instance here, if a large truck drives by you, you might veer a little bit to the left, or you might veer a little bit to the right. Now, in a given scenario, nothing may happen. But over millions of these types of scenarios, if you stay close to the truck, you may actually end up harming the passengers. Also, over millions of scenarios, if you're closer to the cyclist, you may end up killing a cyclist at some point. So these things will emerge in the accident statistics, and they are ethical in nature. They are ethical trade-offs. And this is not really something that is science fiction. This is an actual Google patent filed a few years ago for autonomous driving. And in here, the car has to decide whether to overtake a truck that is stuck at the light. And the car has to make a decision. Again, this is from the patent filing. And it computes a risk penalty that is based on the probability of different outcomes, as well as the risk magnitude or the penalty of these outcomes. So you could think of these things as the liability, the financial liability or the reputational liability of different kinds of accidents, right? So these things are really going to make it into actual products. Now, the media has been very active in discussing this question, and when the car makers started talking about these topics and making statements about what the cars should do, they got in trouble. For instance, one major car manufacturer of luxury vehicles said, you should protect the person in the car, and they quickly got in trouble. Tabloids started calling them, saying that they will kill children in order to protect the wealthy owners of these cars. Obviously not very good public relations move. Now, what happened is they withdrew this statement, and they said, we will do what is legal and what is socially acceptable, but we actually don't know what that is, because nobody has run a survey until we did. Now, some other technology leaders have been a bit more active and proactive in talking about the importance of ethics. And even President Obama himself spoke to Joey Ito, who's the director of the Media Lab, about this topic and identified this issue as a moral one. Now, in my own research, what we did was we surveyed people and asked them, what kind of ethics do you wish the car to follow in given situations? And I'll give you first the result that we published a couple of years ago, which is summarized in this line. I would never buy a car that will sacrifice me, but I want everybody else to buy such cars. So there is a contradiction here, or there's the disconnect between what I think is good for society and what I'm willing to contribute to bring about that outcome. Okay, this is an old problem. It's called the social dilemma or tragedy of the commons, and it's very difficult to solve. Now, what we did after that is my students have built this website called The Moral Machine, which you can visit yourself and try. The Moral Machine creates more complex scenarios. They're still admittedly cartoonish. They're still simple. But there's 26 million possible comparisons that you can make, because we change the age and the gender and sometimes the species of the different victims. Sometimes they're jaywalking. Sometimes they're not, and so on. And thanks to some traditional media, but also to some social media celebrities, we garnered significant support and interest in this platform. In fact, we translated it to about 10 languages. We have 40 million decisions now from people worldwide, from over 4 billion users. And we also have a wealth of detailed data about people's demographics as well. So this has inadvertently become the largest ethical, experimental ethics survey ever conducted. And we actually have coverage of the entire world, not just the US or the West. And you can compare it to the map of the lit world, and you can see that we actually have a fairly good representativeness in our data. Now, this is the first time I actually present some of the data that we've analyzed from this large survey. And I thought that maybe we can take some votes just with the hands to make it quick. And I want to ask you here, what do you think the car should do? So you're an external observer, you're looking at this situation, and you're being asked, what do you think the programmer of the car should program it to behave in this scenario? So if the car continues ahead, it's going to hit a barrier, and the 2 people in the car are going to die. But if the car swerves, it's going to kill 2 pedestrians. What do you think the car should do? How many people would say, let the car keep going straight? Okay, what about swerve? Okay, so I would say more people say, let it go straight. So people here are favoring pedestrians to some extent, and indeed, this is what we find in our data. Okay, let's pick another scenario. Now, in this scenario, we have a child crossing the street, but you can swerve and kill an adult. You can see here that the car is empty. Maybe it dropped you at work and it's going to park itself, and it finds itself in this situation. How many people would say, let the car keep going straight? Almost. Okay. And how many people would swerve? Great. Okay. So clearly the imperative to save a child is greater than the imperative not to intervene, right? And indeed, this is what we found in our sample. Now I'm going to show you a couple more. So in this case, the car can swerve to kill a person who's crossing illegally to save a person crossing legally. Okay? So how many people would stay in this case? Go ahead. And how many people would swerve? Okay. So I ran this thing. Indeed, most people would say swerve. And when I ran this with a major car manufacturer in Germany last year, in Germany, this number was even higher. You make your own interpretation. Okay, and now one more. And in this case, there are two people crossing illegally. So what do you think is more important, saving more lives or saving the person who hasn't done anything wrong? Okay, so how many would go straight? How many would swerve? Okay, I would say about 50-50. And indeed, this is where roughly it goes. And in Germany, of course, swerve is more than 50%. But what this really highlights is that there are different considerations that we have to take. There are different values that come into conflict very quickly. And this really challenges our own ethics and challenges us to figure this out together because we don't agree on all of these things. Now, actually, Germany has been the first country to create an ethical guidelines for autonomous vehicles. They created an ethics commission, which consists of people from all walks of life, including lawyers and engineers and car enthusiasts and pedestrian, safety people, even a Catholic bishop. It sounds like a setup for a joke. But here is what they came up with. So first they said, well, if you can avoid the situation in the first place, that should be your priority, which I think we can all agree on. The second thing they said is that any distinction based on personal features is prohibited. And notice that this includes age. So they're not allowing to prioritize children, something that you felt very strongly about. So I think this is an example where even the regulators may not get it right necessarily. Also, general programming to reduce the number of injuries may be justifiable, but it's not mandated. So that's another thing where it's not enforced. And finally, parties involved in the generation of the mobility risk must not sacrifice non-involved parties. So this is the case of if you jaywalk, then you should not, somebody else should not be harmed because of your mistake. So we have actually analyzed the data. The work is currently in review. And I just wanted to say that we've learned a bunch of really interesting things. And one of them is that Asimov is kind of wrong, because you cannot have universal machine ethics. You cannot have a simple set of rules that applies to the whole world. So when we did this analysis and we compared Germany to other countries, we compared the West to the East, we found very interesting cultural differences in expectations. And these things correlate with a lot of institutional and cultural variables. And I think that's important because if we are to build machines that reflect our own values, then we need to understand those values more, and we need to quantify them as well. And we need to also negotiate in order to agree on what these things are and what the important ones are. Thank you so much.